Here's what you need to understand about getting your video recommended. The recommended is probably the place where 90% of your views come from. And this is something where the bigger channels, those channels that you see getting hundreds of thousands of views and millions of views every single month, this is where they're getting their views from. So how do you break through the recommended system and get into the suggested videos? The suggested tab is basically based on two key factors. Well, we're going to be talking about two key factors, and the other video will talk about the secret factor that I believe is determining whether or not a video gets recommended. But we'll leave that to later. There are two main factors. Number one is going to be CTR. Number two is going to be watch time. So how does CTR affect YouTube recommended? If you don't know what click-through rate is, click-through rate can be explained here. For those of you who don't know what a click-through rate is, it's fairly simple. It basically means if your click-through rate is high, at around 20%, your video will do well. And if your click-through rate is low, like 5%, people aren't clicking your video, and your video will do worse. For example, if you had 5 clicks and 100 impressions, then your CTR would be 5%. Ideally, you want 100 people to see your video, and for those 100 people to click it. Ideally, when looking at the sidebar of YouTube, you want your click-through rate to be higher than the average. That way, your views will be higher than normal, and thus, your video will go viral. So, when you have such an amazing thumbnail composition, it's nearly impossible for the viewer not to click. And what happens when you have nearly everyone clicking a video? It goes viral. Now that you understand click-through rate, you understand that click-through rate basically means how much someone is clicking on a video. So the higher the click-through rate is, the better chance you have at your video being recommended. And that's the reason why this is one of the most popular metrics for YouTube to base a video being recommended on, because it shows whether or not a viewer is actually interested in a video or not. If people aren't clicking on your video, then they aren't actually going to watch it and recommend it, which means YouTube is not going to put that video in front of more people's eyes. So if your video is being clicked a lot, and it does have a high CTR, your video will get recommended even more. Which is why we're talking about in this course. We place a very high emphasis on making sure you design thumbnails that are clicked. It's the reason we advocate for making sure you spend as much time as you do editing, making the thumbnail. Because if people never click your video then they're never going to see all the work and effort you put into editing the video anyways. So you should always make sure you spend as much time as possible when making your thumbnail. What I like to do is I make my thumbnail before the video is actually done. Sometimes in some niches, this isn't actually possible. But if it is possible for you, you need to do this before. And the reason you need to do this before is because sometimes you'll get better ideas and you're able to ask for feedback from friends and colleagues. And in the group chat of this course, I should be able to help you. You need to understand that CTR is a huge determining factor on whether or not your video will be chosen for the recommendation system. One thing I've noticed is that 90% of people that make YouTube channels cannot design thumbnails to save their life. And I really don't understand why people are focusing heavily on growing channels when they need to focus on designing better thumbnails. I've personally seen some channels that if I were to change the thumbnails and titles, their views would simply skyrocket. And I've seen some channels that have successfully done this and increased their viewership. So understand that your thumbnail and titles are one of the key factors that determine whether or not your video is recommended. Now, the next thing that is focusing on your YouTube recommendation system, or YouTube suggested, is going to be your watch time. Now, your watch time is basically your average view duration. What's the average duration someone viewed your video for? Nobody is going to be recommending videos if they aren't being watched all the way to the end. You need to be able to get your videos watched all the way until the end. Now, if you're wondering how do I get people to click on my thumbnails and how do I get people to watch my videos to the end, we talk about this in the other modules. But for now, you need to understand that when getting your video suggested, those are the two metrics that matter most: thumbnails and watch time. Once you've mastered these two, it's going to be really easy to be able to get your videos recommended and out there.